Hi there. Pretty important behind the scenes news for House of the Dragon Season 2 just came out. We finally found out who the new costume designer is going to be for Season 2. Because Janine Tamim, the award-winning designer on Season 1, she's leaving to work on some other movie projects, and she won the Costume Designers Guild Award for her work on House of the Dragon Season 1. She used to work in the Harry Potter franchise and in mid-run onwards, and we were really surprised. Oh, she's leaving. Who's going to replace her? And there was just an IMDb update. It wasn't an announcement. We just found out from an IMDb, oh, they started listing who the new designer is. Carolyn McCall, the costume designer on Downton Abbey, will be the new designer for Season 2. This is really top-tier stuff. We are getting the best on this. Well, I don't say the designer, I say a designer. It's Downton Abbey actually had different designers across its 6 seasons, lasting like 2 seasons each. So there's the early phase, the mid phase, and the late phase. McCall was specifically the lead costume designer in the mid phase, seasons 3 and 4. Like Downton Abbey, Season 1 was showing the pre-war world. It ends in a cliffhanger that World War I got declared. Season 2 is during the war itself. McCall was in charge as costume designer in the immediate post-war seasons, that seasons 3 and 4 like 1921, where they're heading into the roaring 20s. Fashions change. But before, by like seasons 5 and 6, they're running into the... Well, it's still like 1923, but the aristocracy is starting to run out of money because the war sapped everything. But those drastic change, 1921, Roaring 20s, seasons 3 and 4. Tell me in the comments about this. If you remember standouts from that, this is a very experienced costume designer. And more recently, apart from Downton Abbey, she just did all 3 seasons of HBO's His Dark Materials adaptation, which I've heard was very well received, and so she has some fantasy experience. Well, it's like this alternate history, alternate worlds fantasy kind of thing, but closer to that type of fantasy thing. She's worked in HBO's wheelhouse quite recently on His Dark Materials, so tell me about the costuming in there if you've seen that. She worked on one episode of that Jamestown show I really liked on PBS, but it was only one episode. I'm not sure specifically what she did there, but great experience in period dramas, done some recent fantasy stuff. Downton Abbey. I'm all for this. Now, the thing is, I am not a costumes expert, which is why it's interesting to me. I know very little about it, so I've tried to do documentaries on this is what Renaissance costume was like. I did a big one the summer before House of the Dragon Season 1, which was contradicted by a few things that she keeps saying, oh, I'm using 13th and 14th century, but then you're using things that are obviously Tudor stuff. So it's a mix of things. I couldn't really figure out if there was a difference between the way Alicent and Rhaenyra dress other than the coloring. I am not a costuming channel, so I'm humble enough to admit, go to the experts. I'm referring you to the experts here, the expert costuming channels like Costume Co., which is run by Heidi. She has done videos on this type of thing before. I just rewatched her one on House of the Dragon versus Game of Thrones. It was really nice, did a lot of research. Heidi will have a lot to say on Costume Co. about they got Carolyn McCall from Downton Abbey for Season 2. She will have more to say about this than I do. And that's the main part of this video. I'm done with that. That's all I can really say. Just, wow, that's really cool. One thing I can go on about is some awards background. Because just recently, like a month ago, I was doing... Because it was the spring award season, I did videos comparing... these are how Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon did at various awards. And as part of that, I covered, like, Costumes Emmys and how well it's historically done at the Costume Designers Guild Awards, right? So I have some leftover notes from that. I checked some more, just dashing this off. Just looking at those 2 awards. Carolyn McCall is the only person who ever beat Game of Thrones at the Costume Designers Guild Awards. For those 2 seasons, for 3 and 4 for Downton Abbey. Since then, Michelle Clapton consistently not just was nominated, but won every award. And that trend continued through Janine Tamim winning for House of the Dragon Season 1. So this is the only person who can hold a candle to that at the Costume Designers Awards. The Emmys are a little different, though Carolyn McCall has won an Emmy Award. Because they recategorized everything. That Downton Abbey Season 1 was actually the same year that Game of Thrones came out. But Season 1 of Downton Abbey was classified as a mini-series. So they put it in a different category. That she wasn't the lead costume designer, that was Susanna Buxton, but she was the co-designer. She was like an assistant designer in Season 1, and she was co-credited for the Emmy. So Carolyn does have an Emmy Award for Downton Abbey Season 1. She was part of Season 1. I emphasize, she's in the Roaring Twenties stuff so much. She worked on Season 1. An expert like Costume Co. would be able to break down the specifics. I don't know, costume by costume, who was doing it. But she has an Emmy for Season 1 on that. They weren't in the same category that year. And just going down the list here of who was eligible for what. Well, it's complicated that both awards, when they started this, it was just best costumes, right? And it was split between miniseries and series. They don't do that anymore. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're short form or not. So, you'll see WandaVision, which was a one-shot season, or Moon Knight, competing against long-running shows like House of the Dragon. But while they removed the distinction between miniseries and series, they did reclassify it in, I think, a way that works, that is for the better. They split contemporary and period/fantasy in both awards. And they did that for a few years, and then 3 years later, by late Game of Thrones, period drama and fantasy were split yet again. So now there's 3 separate awards. So Game of Thrones wasn't always head-to-head with Downton Abbey by the late season when fantasy was split from period drama. And you're going, well, Game of Thrones consistently won every year, in part because they split the category, so it swept the fantasy category by season 8. Because you've gone, season 7 and 8 didn't have good costumes relative to the early seasons. Around the same time, they invented new categories. And what other fantasy was there? Star Trek and stuff? That a lot of the recent fantasy boom has been in reaction to Game of Thrones ending. Everyone wanted their new Game of Thrones. Like The Witcher, Season 1, was after Game of Thrones ended. The months after that. So, now, it makes sense that there is a category specifically for sci-fi fantasy. That when Tamim was up for Best Costume Sci-Fi Fantasy at the Costume Designers Guild Awards, she was up against Lord of the Rings. There was The Witcher in there. There really wasn't that. It feels like a real award, and she managed to win it. Versus Game of Thrones Season 8, there wasn't that much competition it was against in the early seasons. So I didn't want this video to run long, so I typed up my notes as slides here, pause to read if you want, of who were they up against. But, the only real rivals were, Emmys, it was different. The early seasons, the Borgias won twice. But beyond, and then The Crown was winning, then they recategorized everything, so they split everything, so now period and fantasy are in 2 separate categories. But just that thing that the one person who ever beat Game of Thrones at the Costume Designers Guild was Carolyn McCall, Downton Abbey, and now they have her here. And I really I hope she continues the trend that Janine Tamim did of pushing for realism in the costumes. I don't blame Clapton for, it's a fantasy world, it should look different. Because it wasn't too outlandish, but still, Tamim went with, they look like Tudor designs. It's supposed to look like this is a lost era of, they look more advanced than the stuff during Game of Thrones, because the Tudors came after the War of the Roses. Well, because it's this height of peace and prosperity, that they're a golden age that they never achieve again. And Heidi talks about that in her videos I just recently watched too. But all that makes sense. The big question is, Season 1 focused on the Targaryens, right? And their close allies, the people at the royal court, like the Velaryons and Hightowers. Season 2, the world is going to expand out to see all the other great houses. I mean, Jace went to see the Arryns and the Starks. Like, how does Jane Arryn, who rules all of the Vale, she's a powerful noblewoman, how does she dress? How does her companion, Jess Redfort, dress? And how do the Starks dress? We saw a little of the Lannisters, like at the army camp, but we haven't really seen much of the Lannisters. All of the Riverlands. Like, we've seen men in tunics. We haven't seen, women in costumes. The Hightower main army, we've seen very little of the other great houses. We've seen bits and pieces here and there, but they need rounding out. So, Tamim established this template. It now falls to Carolyn McCall to invent the looks in this prequel era for the other great houses from all of the Seven Kingdoms. And I'm looking forward to it. She's one of, if you name on one hand the top people in this field they could have picked. When you ask, why didn't Game of Thrones get the best sometimes? We are getting the best for this. So, please, Costume Co. will have more to say about this than I do, but I look forward to the comments. People who know a lot more about costuming than I do will probably have some strong opinions about this.